Okay, so some special operations and station restrictions. Talks a little bit more about spurious emissions, the restrictions on antennas, um, gets into PRB1, which I haven't heard much about whether that's actually been approved. That was the one where it's supposed to stop the homeowners associations from preventing you from putting up an antenna. They have to reasonably accommodate you, but I don't know if it ever actually got passed.
But, and this is the way I look at that, if you don't hear anything, then it's business as usual.
Yeah.
ARRL and every publication out there would have been on top of it if it got approved.
But you still threaten them with it. They probably wouldn't look it up, see whether it was approved or not.
That national was Florida. Florida.
National.
Tussling.
Um, yeah, and one of the things in 97.1 is that part of amateur radio is the continuation and extension of the amateur's unique ability to enhance international goodwill. So it allows us to freely communicate with stations all over the world, unless they have notified the ITU that they don't want to talk to us. And I don't believe, I think there's only maybe one country.
There's two,
Two?
Korea and Yemen, who don't allow their citizens to operate radio, personal radio. Is it
North Korea or something?
the bad one? I can never remember.
North Korea.
What's that?
North Korea is
North Korea. Yeah. But the thing is, neither one of them allow their citizens to operate personal radios. So anybody that would have a radio, you can talk to you at the moment.
Yeah, because we can still broadcast to them. They just don't, not allowed to answer. And so, okay, so when is it permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the Federal Communications Commission? Bravo. Have we talked about ITU? There's 3 zones, 1, 2, and 3. We're in 2, North and South America. I think 1 is Asia and 3 is Europe. I don't remember. Not that it matters. You just have to remember we're 2. It's the important one. Which of the following is an acceptable bandwidth for digital voice or slow scan TV transmissions made on the HF amateur bands? Yeah, this is one kind of out of left field, doesn't seem to fit with the other stuff. Three kilohertz.
And the A citizen.
Yeah, but it said digital voice over slow scan. Didn't say phone. Although I didn't know digital voice could do 3 kilohertz. I thought it was wider than that.
That's why I was wondering.
At least D-Star and DMR, I'm pretty sure, are wider than 3 kilohertz. So we talked about obscuring messages with encryption or whatever being prohibited. The exceptions are the space station, a space station. You can use the Q signals and Q signals, pro signals, as long as they're not obscuring the meaning. So that applies to other abbreviations. And you can come up with your own new digital protocol. I think this chart's out of place. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service? I know why it was out of place, because some of these general questions are almost identical to the extra questions.
That's fine, I remember something.
Huh?
I remember those at the general, that's what we done.
Let's see. The FCC is the determining body for what they call good engineering and good amateur practice. And a lot of times you'll find some of these answers that say it's good amateur practice. I guess there's the chief engineer for the FCC that determines that. But there is a question. That's why it's red. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I started playing with it yesterday and very mixed results. A lot of wrong answers. They appear right until you really start examining it. Who or what determines good engineering and good amateur practice as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects not covered by the Part 97 rules? And if I didn't mention in the beginning, all these commission rules for amateur radio is Part 97, because there's a lot of rules with all kinds of communications. The amateur stuff is the Part 97 of the rules and regulations. Station location. If you're going to locate in what's designated as a wildlife or wilderness area, you have to perform or prepare an environmental assessment. Not sure who you turn it into. Does that mean if I go to a national park that's a wildlife refuge, I can't operate without sending in an environmental assessment?
I think they're talking about setting up a permanent station. I don't think they're talking about mobile station. Yeah,
It says a facility, but I'm not sure. I mean, what's a facility?
What?
What's a facility? Is it a tent?
I would guess if it's a permanent station.
Okay.
Yeah,
They could have been more specific.
They could have. But they like to leave things, up.
Yeah.
The enforcer.
Yeah. So the lawyers can interpret the meaning?
Yeah.
Huh?
Speaking of photos, I don't know how true it is, but I've been told that you can't put an antenna in a tree anymore in Florida. And the FWC guys, if they see you with a tree, with a wire in the tree for an antenna, they're gonna cite. I haven't heard of anybody getting cited for it yet, but there may be
In a state park or national
well,
park?
yes, all photo parks are state or national, state or
Yeah.
federal parks. But yeah, it came about because somebody put a wire up into a tree and then it got tangled up and they just left it there. That they refused to take responsibility for it. So a bunch of other people decided to go out and correct it, but yeah, FWC doesn't like the idea.
Yeah. They get picky. I got in trouble cutting a limb off a tree in the national park in Colorado. They didn't like that.
Me and my son were
I mean, hell is a little,
I was camping off the town in the middle of freaking, it's like 10 miles or we made a little retreat, like 50 feet from the campsite, so. I get up in the middle of the night and go to the bed, I just got my little flashlight and then like, tiny whiteys and that's it, they're walking over there. An FWC officer, are you trying to get your?
yeah.
Holy, where the fuck did you come from?
Was that even the hunt deer or something?
You shine deer to fall.
Oh.
You just shot
Oh.
at night, and, you know, it's pretty.
Yeah, it's a little bad. It's interesting you thought this would be.
And then one time I was dragging an alligator back from, river conservation, I had tags and license, don't worry. And I ran into hikers and they're sitting there, where's the going, with the killer deer? Fine.
Careful, we're being recorded.
Yeah.
And then, I took it back to the car and FWC sitting there, and I knew the guy, I'm like, hey, how you doing? I'm saying, this week's help. Yeah, you're tall, but I see you're good. I'm like, yeah, thanks. And last story, one time I'm hunting deer out there, and a bunch of hikers come by, and you don't know to hunt deer either. You go away. And harassing a hunter is a misdemeanor in Florida.
Oh,
So I'm sitting there, I'm got my scope on, I'm on a little berm looking out over the edge, and they're going this way, not that way. And they decide they're gonna pee all over the area just to put symptoms to me. So I just let one off. Shoot around us, and fuck you, More than another, I throw it down, see that 5 seconds, get the fuck at it. Totally cops on you, go, good, I'll file the rest of you. Never mind, sorry guys.
okay. So amateurs transmitting in the 70 centimeter and up, basically, are not supposed to cause interference with U.S. government stations in the radio location service. I don't really know what that is.
We know where it is.
Hmm?
We know where it is.
We do?
Hmm.
The location service?
No question.
Well, I think you're mixing it up with the quiet zone. What must the control operator of a repeater operate in the 70 centimeter band do if a radio location system experiences interference from that repeater? Maybe that's one of those that causes these scans on the different bands that go around. Okay, maybe you were thinking of this one,
I'm thinking.
the National Radio Quiet Zone. It says area Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia. Okay. Yeah, because I thought it was the stuff around the Green Bank Observatory. I don't know how big that area is, but I guess we're not allowed to operate in that area. Maybe the next one. Yeah. What is the National Radio Quiet Zone? Okay, we're not allowed to cause interference with the domestic broadcast service. I assume that's this regular AM, FM broadcast. In the case where you are interfering, they have these rules where you have to operate from 8 o'clock at night to 10:30, and on Sunday from 10:30 a.m. until 1 p.m. if you're interfering. Seems like a weird rule that probably came about as some incident and that was their fix. instead of prohibiting it altogether, so you can operate in these hours, what? 8 PM to 10:30 PM broadcast is kind of a prime time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it says the amateur station shall not operate during.
Yeah.
Oh, shall not. Oh, I got it backwards. I didn't read it again. What limitations may the FCC place on an amateur station if its signal causes interference to domestic broadcast reception, assuming that the receivers involved are of good engineering design? Yep. Let's see. Oh. You're not allowed to interfere with an FCC monitoring facility. So I don't quite, it seemed like you could interfere with it if you were more than a mile away too, but so if you're within a mile, you're not allowed to interfere with the FCC monitoring facility, and I understand there's not many of them around anyway. But in the Part 97 stuff, they do tell you where they're at. Let's see. So you need to try to eliminate or avoid interference when you're within a mile of the FCC monitoring station, and when you're using a band where you're secondary, or when you're sending spread spectrum emissions. Which of the following conditions require a licensed amateur radio operator to take specific steps to avoid harmful interference to other users or facilities? Within what distance must an amateur station protect an FCC monitoring facility from harmful interference? Spurious emissions, or definition is frequencies outside the necessary bandwidth of a transmission. Which of the following constitutes a spurious emission? Delta. Antenna structure restrictions. Huh?
That's okay, man. Just go back and listen.
Oh, yeah.
In which one?
Back from,
Double, must have been.
I.
Oh. Yeah, I remember now. I didn't catch it. I went back to capitalize it and it didn't erase the little one. According to the FAA, there's a 200-foot height limit on antennas up to, well, actually, it's less than that, at 20,000 feet from a public or military airport. The closer you get to the airport, the height restriction goes down. So if you're more than, the way I understand, if you're more than 20,000 feet, however many miles that is, then that restriction is no longer a problem. You have to worry about local and homeowners and stuff.
Yeah.
What's the maximum height above ground for an antenna structure not near a public use airport without requiring notification of the FAA and registration with the FCC?
So it's not.
Said what?
It says not, does that mean it's beyond 20,000 feet?
Yeah, that implies,
4 miles.
go back and read that again.
That makes sense.
Because here, I don't know that we're limited to 200 feet. There's lots of more than 200-foot towers right around here.
Yeah, usually they have construction like.
Yeah, but I mean, when you're building a 200-foot tower, it's not digging a hole in the backyard. It's
Yeah.
a little bit of, you probably need a building permit.
Yeah.
If you go over 200 feet, then there's all kinds of rules about lighting and paint colors and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, but that question doesn't make sense.
It's not going.
But do you have to notify the FAA and register with the FCC?
Yes,
Okay. Well, you should know.
yeah. We had a 500-foot tower for our repeater in Fayetteville, Georgia.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure not to go over 200 feet.
Yeah, you just got to fill out lots of paper.
And pay the appropriate fee, right?
Of course. It has to do with anything over 200 feet. It has to go on the aeronautical sectional charts.
Okay. Okay, PRB1. Oh, do you know what the status of PRB1 is? I guess not. Last I heard, it hadn't been approved in the legislature. It basically says that homeowners associations and local governments must make reasonable accommodations for radio amateurs antennas, essentially. Where there's a lot of homeowners associations now which don't let you put up any kind of antenna at all if it's visible or they know about it. So this is intended to mitigate that.
Yeah, they can continue to be unreasonable.
Yeah. So if you're going to live in a HOA, you need to find one where the people on the board are amateur radio operators. Under what conditions are state and local governments permitted to regulate amateur radio antenna structures? Yeah, Delta is very wordy, must be right. Let's see. We talked about being near an airport. Which of the following additional rules apply if you're installing an amateur station antenna at a site at or near a public use airport? According to Ron, it's alpha. So there's,
So PRB one was filed 40 years ago and still hasn't passed.
as far as I know, it hadn't been passed yet. I thought here last year they were close, but I think we would have heard something. I'm sure ARL would have put something out. What type of regulations does PRB 1 apply? Charlie. What does PRB 1 require of regulations affecting amateur radio? Of course, see, the lawyers put that reasonable, so now you can argue what's reasonable.
Yep.
RACES, uh, they call it a quasi-government organization, but it's a FEMA thing, and you have to be a FCC licensed amateur and I've never understood the relation with the Civil Defense Organization. If you actually have to join it or get some approval, what that part of it means. But it's different than ARES, where ARES is not associated with civil defense, and RACES is. That's the big difference. And there's limitations, so you can't transmit in RACES unless you're a FCC licensed club or station. And it has to be certified. Like I said, I don't know how you get a civil defense certification, but I guess when you actually go through the RACES training and all that, that's part of the whole deal. There's something here about the War Emergency Powers Act. And RACES can only transmit on authorized frequencies as part of Part 214. Which amateur stations may be operated under RACES rules? Charlie. Civil defense is the key word to remember. All right. What frequencies are authorized to an amateur station operating under RACES rules? That's a good one.
The RACES qualified control operators. Yeah. Don't say that, but
Yeah, that's kind of a cagey way of saying it. One-way transmissions, which is essentially broadcasting or remote control. Normally they're prohibited, but there's a lot of exceptions. Beacons is one of the exceptions because beacons is the one just transmit, no two-way communications. There's some limitations on beacons, and there's a list of frequency bands they can operate on, but you're only allowed to have one beacon per band per station. So you could have a bunch of beacons, but each one has to be on a different band in your station. Or it has to cycle through. I know some of the, Chuck brought up the WSPR transmitter thing last week, where you can have it set up to transmit on each of the WSPR bands, cycle through them. So I guess that would apply since you're only on one at a time. You're limited to 100 watts PEP and limited to the 20, 17, 15, and 10 meter bands. There has to be a control operator, but it's basically automatic operation if you're doing it on the 28.2 to 28.3 segment. I was trying to think, on a Pico balloon, it's basically a beacon. It's on, most of the ones we've done on 20 meters. And it's definitely no control operator.
Runs till it quits.
Uh-huh.
It's not until it quits.
Yeah. Which of the following is a purpose of a beacon station as identified in the FCC rules? What's the power limit for beacon stations?
Bob, I think the Pico balloons may be below the power limit.
Well, let's see. Mine was, I think, 10 milliwatts. Which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply? On what HF frequencies are automatically controlled beacons permitted? You say alpha? Oh, delta. To avoid interference with propagation beacon stations, you should normally not transmit on those frequencies. And they list them down there, which, since I have them in red, I guess you have to remember those. There's probably a question where you have to at least know one of them. Or all of them. Why should an amateur operator normally avoid transmitting on all those frequencies? They made it easy. Other one-way transmissions, you can apparently occasionally retransmit weather and propagation information or news. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody doing that, although I guess ARL, W1AW does. And then they also do the code transmissions, which are one way.
Thursday night, and there's everyone's listening. A lot of times, like the their wall, I'll just get general news at the club or something. I'm talking on specific. It's close up the eye.
Yeah, I picked up a RIDI transmission from them one night with a bunch of that news kind of information.
Yeah.
I never found it again. This just happened to happen.
Yes.
Yeah. Wasn't too clear when they do the RIDI things.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that. I just know the 2 meter ones is Thursday night.
Which of the following transmissions is permitted? Which of the following one-way transmissions are permitted? Okay, and then they threw in this 3 kilohertz one, which I moved up. That's why it was in the other spot. Which of the, I forgot to erase this one. We already answered this one. Everybody knows it, right? 3 kilohertz. Okay, so we can only talk to foreign countries who don't have an exception of communicating with them. We can use abbreviations and Q signals and pro signs and all that kind of stuff as long as they don't obscure the meaning of the message. Good engineering amateur practice is determined by somebody in the FCC. We're not allowed to have a station located where it can interfere with the radio location service or the National Radio Observatory or domestic broadcast, where we may have to be prohibited from operating at specific times. We're not supposed to be within a mile of the FCC monitoring station. Avoid bands where we're or interfering on bands where we're secondary, and avoid interference doing spread spectrum. Or FCC stations at least a mile away. The definition of spurious emissions, where it's a signal that's outside the normal bandwidth that can be eliminated without affecting the information. Antennas limited to 200 feet before you have to notify the FAA and the FCC. PRB1, if it ever passes, will force state and local governments to have reasonable accommodation for amateur radio antennas. RACES stations must be controlled by an FCC licensed amateur and certified by a civil defense organization, and operate on frequencies authorized to the control operator for RACES. One-way transmissions are prohibited except for the beacons. One beacon per band per station, 100-watt PEP limit on those 4 bands. I don't quite understand. They must have a control operator. Normally you don't necessarily physically have one, depending on where it is. It does allow automatic operation on the part of the 10-meter band. You can occasionally retransmit weather and other propagation information or news or Morse code practice. And the acceptable bandwidth on HF for digital voice and slow scan is 3 kilohertz.